and some new faces, so welcome. It's wonderful to have you all today. It's my honor this morning to introduce our speaker, Dr. Francis Feingold. Francis Feingold received his PhD in philosophy from the Catholic University of America in 2018. He taught at Ave Maria University in Florida and at St. Patrick's Seminary in San Francisco before starting here at Kenrick Seminary this past fall as Associate Professor of Philosophy. His main interests are St. Thomas Aquinas' metaphysics and ethics, including issues like God's relation to the world and the nature of love and of the good. He also enjoys studying ancient and medieval philosophy more generally, as well as more recent figures like Pascal and Dietrich von Hildebrand. Outside of philosophy, he enjoys singing Renaissance polyphony and spending time with his wife and 4 children. The title of his talk this morning is Weeping with Those Who Weep. Is Compassion Always Good? Please join me in welcoming Dr. Francis Feingold.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you today. It's an honor to be here. When we were picking this topic, I hadn't thought about, and picking the topic and the date, hadn't thought about, talking about sadness for others in the middle of the Easter season. Maybe this would have been better for Lent. On the other hand, it was Divine Mercy Sunday, just this past Sunday, so we'll say that that was the plan. Okay. It's commonplace today, right, to say that compassion is pretty unqualified good, right? Where by compassion we mean not just doing good to relieve others' misery, sending checks to your charities, but also feeling their misery, right? In fact, I think you could say that this is one of the points of pride for our culture, right? That we think that in contrast to previous more barbaric ages, right, we really have like this warmth, this sympathy, this tenderness, and this is what sets us apart. If you watch candidates on the campaign trail, right, this is usually what they're trying to sell you, that they really feel your pain, right? And we see it in people around us. I think of my own grandmother, wonderful person, feels like she has a responsibility to feel everyone's pain, right, close, far away, on the news. And on the one hand, right, it seems like this is a really noble thing. On the other hand, it can be a little crushing, sometimes can even lead to some anger against God, right? So it seems like there's an insight here, there's something that needs to be balanced. So that's what I want to look into here. Right, so the basic question, right, we've got this contemporary, you might say, enthronement of compassion. Is it good? Is it right? Does it go too far? And so to break this down, here's what I'm thinking of for an outline. We'll look at a few different views on pity that people have given. There's some non-Christian views. Some people are going to put it really on a pedestal. Others are not going to have great things to say about it. Put it in contrast with you might say, the more measured Christian view. We'll be following Augustine and Thomas Aquinas for that. And we'll ask questions like, so first, passions in general. When is it good to feel passion, when not? Compassion in particular, why would that be good? We have this instinct that it is, but why is that? Are there different kinds, different motivations? Are some motivations for compassion better than others? Is compassion a problem in any respect? Like, is there something evil or imperfect about it? What are the right objects for compassion? And I'm not sure that the Christian idea is quite the same as the secular, the popular idea of what you should be having compassion for. And then finally, how do we put compassion together with the Christian ideal of conformity to God's will, trust in God's providence? Okay, so putting all that together, hopefully we'll come away with a clearer picture, both of why there is such a thing as healthy compassion, and of how and why it can go astray. So, starting with non-Christian philosophers, I think you can make a pretty good case that the roots of our sort of contemporary the pedestal that we've put compassion on goes back to some philosophers from the Enlightenment in the 1700s. I'm thinking especially of a guy called David Hume and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who were actually friends for about 1 year before they became bitter enemies. But anyway, that's its own story. Right, so David Hume, kind of the founder of modern English-speaking philosophy, right, he puts sympathy at the basis of all of morality and all of ethics. Right? This is the foundation, the cornerstone for him. I'll just give you a quote. So he says, "No qualities are more entitled to the general goodwill and approbation of mankind than benevolence, humanity," that means humaneness, friendship, gratitude, affection, public spirit, or whatever proceeds from a tender sympathy with others. That's the goal. And he says elsewhere, right, this affection of humanity alone can be the foundation of morals or of any general system of blame or praise. And what he means by sympathy is just this basic instinct that we all have of, you see a smile on somebody else's face and it brings a smile to yours. You see somebody crying and you start having some tears coming. And so feeling with. Same sort of thing with Rousseau. Right? So he's like the founder of our modern political philosophy in general and the culture. And so he says, as human beings, we've got these two basic fundamental motives. So self-interest on the one hand, but kind of balanced with that, a natural repugnance at seeing any other being with feelings, especially of our species. He was an animal lover too, but especially of our own species, suffer pain or death. And so long as you don't resist that internal impulse of compassion, that's what it takes to be a good person, never to hurt any other person. And if nature had not given man pity to aid their reason, men would always have been monsters, right? It's from pity alone that all the social virtues flow. And what is it for him? It consists in transporting ourselves outside of ourselves, identifying with the suffering animal, he says, by leaving, as it were, our own being to take on its own being, to take on its being. We suffer just as much as we judge that it suffers. So again, it's pairing suffering with suffering, and it's this very instinctive thing. And interestingly for Rousseau, it's based on a sense of your own weakness, right? You only pity something in others if you think it might happen to you too. If you think you're invincible, you're not going to pity. And so it comes out of a sense of your own weakness, and it's not limited to just benevolence for Rousseau. It's about even things that you can't help, he wants you to feel that sorrow, that pity for it. Okay, and this sympathy as it shows up in these guys, and it's got you might say it's kind of the replacement for an older social glue that belonged in the Middle Ages and the ancient times, and everybody saw themselves as part of a natural society, as part of a whole. That disappeared in the 1500s, and you got replaced by this very atomistic, individualistic philosophy that you find in people like Hobbes and Locke, and it's all like dog eat dog, and we're trying to construct morality kind of out of fear, out of desire for security. And so these guys, Hume and Rousseau, are proposing sympathy or pity as a sort of basic instinct to replace both of those models. And that's how we got where we are today. But they're not the only view. So if you go back a bit in time to the ancient Stoics, you'll find that pity is actually not held in very high regard there. So the Stoics were really big into reason. Right? It's all about being rational. And part of being rational means being at peace, right? Being unperturbed. It's kind of like Buddhism today in a lot of ways. Right? So it's all about being rational, being at peace. And so any sort of like agitation, passion, no good. And they give 4 kinds of those, which includes pain, also fear, desire, and pleasure. And one of the aspects of pain is pity. It's an irrational contraction. You shouldn't be feeling this. There are good emotions, rational things that they want you to feel, but it doesn't include pain. Just joy, wish, caution, all of that, but never being torn apart on the inside. That's something that the wise man doesn't feel. Right, so in the ancient times, Pity was seen as like something that somebody who's really well set up, not going to feel it. If you go to some neo-pagans, I'm thinking of Friedrich Nietzsche, you guys heard of him, so he's very not into pity as well. And he says, what's more harmful than any vice? Practical sympathy with all the botched and the weak. Christianity. Christianity is called the religion of pity. Pity is opposed to the tonic passions which enhance the energy of the feeling of life. It's depressing. A man loses power when he pities. By means of pity, the drain on strength which suffering itself already introduces into the world, right? So somebody out there is suffering, weak, lying, knocked on the ground. It's multiplied 1,000-fold in all the rest of us. Through pity, suffering itself becomes infectious. And he goes on to talk about how specifically it's crazy that our Christian culture spends all this time in compassion for this one man, Jesus, 2,000 years ago. So, okay, very neo-pagan. You probably don't want to follow him on this. So where does the Christian fall between these sort of two competing views, right? So you've got this pro-sympathy view. It's the most important thing, foundation of everything. Then you've got this other view where it's irrational, it's weakness. What do we do? So Augustine, when he talks about this, quotes a bunch of biblical lines. I'm just going to give you some of those first as giving us some orientation. Right, so the one that I picked for my title is one of them, Romans 12:15. Rejoice with those who rejoice with those who rejoice, and weep with those who weep. Right, so we've got a command to do that. And he also quotes one of the Psalms. I looked for someone who would weep with me, and I found none. It's one of the ones we use during Lent. Or Romans again, so this is St. Paul talking, I have great sorrow, unceasing anguish in my heart, for I could wish that I myself were even accursed and cut off from Christ for the sake of my brethren, my kinsmen by race. In other words, he's torn up about how his fellow Israelites are not coming to Christianity. This is not something that he should just be indifferent to. He should care. Right? This should cause anguish. He has other phrases to the same effect. And then you got Christ himself. Right? You've got the man with the withered hand whom he heals on the Sabbath, and he's looking around at the Pharisees who are being annoyed by this, and he looks around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart. So Christ does this too. Right? You've got Jesus weeping over Jerusalem a little bit further on, and not just for sins, he even weeps over Lazarus, which, it's kind of crazy when you think about it, because A, he's God, he decided that Lazarus was going to die, and B, he knew he was going to raise him up in a few minutes. But he weeps over this evil for Lazarus. Okay, so that's, right, so our Revelation presents compassion to us as being good. So how should we understand this? Right, so first, let me say some things that Augustine and Aquinas say in their response to the Stoics. Right? So the Stoics had this view, right? Should be calm, should be at peace, completely rational. And so what Augustine and Thomas Aquinas following him say is, well, you got to distinguish between passions. Right? So there are some passions which just flare up. Right? They're out of your control, and those are dangerous. Sometimes they're going in the right direction, luckily, and they help you do the right thing. But there's no guarantee of that. They might be going totally in the wrong direction, or it might be the right direction but way too much or too little. Right? So the Stoics are right that kind of passion you got to watch out for. Right? And your action's going to be better the more that it's free from that irrational passion. But following Aristotle, he's also going to say, but if your passion flows from reason, oh, that's good. That's better. That means that you're not just acting with cool calculation, but with love. Right? So what Aquinas proposes to us is that really good action, it's not just doing the right thing for the right reason, it's doing the right thing for the right reason with passion guided by reason. Right? So reason first. Do you think, is this the right? How evil is this? How good is this in proportion to the grand scheme of things? This is pretty good. I should rejoice. Yes. Now I rejoice. Or conversely, right? If it's sadness, like, how bad is this really? That's kind of bad. Okay, I'll be sad. Right, so they have this optimism that you really can train yourself to guide your emotions that way. So if you do that, it can be good. Right, so on the one hand, right, passions don't have to be irrational. They can flow from reason. It takes practice. It takes a lifetime of practice, but they think you can do it. And right, they think the Stoics, on the one hand, were too pessimistic about our ability to control our passions. On the other hand, too optimistic about the wise man's being free from evils. Even the wise man, right, he's going to have at least some slight sins of his own right now. Nobody's perfect. He'll have things in his past life to repent of. You should keep on doing that. Sure, like having a tree fall on your roof in a tornado isn't like isn't the worst thing in the world, but it's a real evil. It's okay to feel a bit sad about that. And your friends, right? They have real evils of all sorts, right? Both trees falling on their houses, but also, more importantly, sins. Right? And so he thinks that the wise man should have sorrow for all of those things. All right, and so the idea here, and he's following, I'm going to channel Augustine here, right? Being perfect, right? The Stoics thought that being perfect is about, or at least involves, having this kind of interior state, which they would think of as peace. And Augustine loves peace as much as the next guy. He's got written tons of stuff in praise of it. But for him, the important thing, right, is love for the right things. And all of these emotions that we feel, right, these are manifestations of love. They're going to be just as good as the love which they're manifesting is good. All right, so he's got some pretty strong things to say about people who want to be free from pain at all costs. He says to be quite free from pain while we are in this place of misery is only purchased at the great price of blunted sensibilities, both of mind and body. And that's a kind of a wimpy translation. Stupor, like numbness. Right, so in this life, that's not good. But he is torn because, gosh, it seems as though there's something problematic about sadness. Sadness seems incompatible with happiness. And so he says, yeah, it's really good for us to have it in this life, not in the next. And that's where he leaves you. So let's delve a little bit more into why sadness might be like a necessary good. And so the reason's going to be not because sadness is good in its own right, but it's because it's a manifestation of love. Right, so what does it mean to have love for somebody? I mean, it can mean, right, that you desire their company, they're like the light of your eyes, and that they brighten up your day and all that sort of thing. And that's one aspect. And the other aspect of love is taking them as another self, right? And these two should go hand in hand. Right? You desire them, but you also step into their shoes. You see the world through their eyes, right? And so what does that mean? That just means rejoicing in their good as if it were yours, or grieving over their evil as if that were yours, right? So there's a logical connection between, it seems to me, following Aquinas, between actually having genuine love for somebody and taking their evils just as if they were yours. And their goods, right? But also their evils, right? And so that means, I'm quoting him, right? That means that the friend himself seems to undergo the good and the bad in his friend, as it were, and to be affected by them. And so because of this, he's quoting Aristotle now, it's proper for friends to will the same things, to sorrow over and rejoice in the same things. Okay, and the basis for it, right, and he says, that's going to be the most important motive of compassion, right? So he says there's two different motives that can be given for compassion, right? And one of them is this union of affection. You've taken the other as your beloved. He or she is another self now, and right, so you experience their evils as your own. Can also be because of what we saw Rousseau talking about, that gosh, I'm weak. I see this awful thing happen to them. It could happen to me too. Oh gosh, that's really depressing. right? And that's also a reason for pity, but we can tell that that's not quite as noble as the other one. It's not bad necessarily. It's good to be conscious of your own frailty. And if that can move you to then do something good for the other person, great. But it's not, right? The noble thing is the compassion that springs out of this self-identification with the other. And Aquinas makes a point of saying, right, so if you really have genuine love for the other, and this is going to mean not simply doing goods for the other, right? So benevolence is good, right? So when you see somebody good, you want to do good things for them, that's great. But if you really love them, there's got to be this union of affection, right? That doing good has got to ultimately spring from that having taken them as another self with all of the feeling their evil that goes with that. So what have you gotten at this point? I think you've gotten at least a bit of a counterpoint to Nietzsche's complaint that pity is weakness, right? Pity is weakness if it's coming out of the, oh gosh, I'm frail, this could happen to me too, right? Or if it's all about the suffering. But the way Aquinas sees it, right, it's about the goodness primarily. It's about the goodness of the person that you love, and it's about the good of that which you want for them and which you're not going to rest until you get it for them to the best of your power, right? So it's understood rightly. It's not a sulking in your right in your chair. It's a driving force. Part of the reason for why people, I think, sometimes are ambivalent about compassion, right? So the Stoics, Nietzsche, and a bunch of people whom I really respect who follow Aquinas too, is that it seems as though, right, for all that sadness seems to be implied by love, it also seems to be a kind of evil, right? So it might look as though compassion is kind of like a fever, right? So on the one hand, right, you need the fever to kill those germs, but I mean, having a fever just isn't good. Like, it's objectively unhealthy. It's just that the benefits outweigh the real downsides. Right, so is compassion like that? Or for another example, is it like fasting, right? So if you're doing a really extreme fast, not like what I do, but like, what the saints that we read about do, where it's like gone way beyond what's good for health. This isn't just weight loss. This, like, as far as your body's concerned, this is bad, but we still do it because it's good for your soul. So is compassion like that? Does that, okay, so definitely I think a lot of people hold that. I think Aquinas would think otherwise. So one of the things which I find most enlightening about the ancient ethics in general, Aquinas, but he's following Aristotle, he's following Plato, is the distinction that they draw between happiness on the one hand and pleasure on the other, and conversely, between evil on the one hand and suffering on the other. Right, so it's easy for us to think they're the same. People like Hume and Rousseau, whom I quoted at the beginning, would say absolutely they're the same. What does it mean to be happy? It means to feel good. What does it mean to be miserable, pitiable? It means to feel bad, right? To have sadness, to have suffering. But in the Aristotelian Thomistic view, no, what matters is, have you reached your end? Have you reached your goal? Have you gotten to the destination? That's happiness. And delight flows from that, right? You get to the end, you get to the goal, and then your will, your desire comes to rest and says, ah. But it wasn't about the saying, ah. It was about getting to the goal. That's why you're saying, ah. That's why it's good. Without that priority of happiness, reaching the end, perfection, over delight, you can't distinguish between good and bad pleasures. Right, and so it's easy for us Christians to say, yeah, no, happiness isn't the same as pleasure, because we're usually thinking of bodily pleasures. Right, and so it's like Christian mantra to say, no, look for your happiness somewhere else. But we often tend to think about it as, well, don't look for physical pleasures, look for spiritual pleasures. And Aquinas would say, no, it's not even about the spiritual pleasures. It's about the spiritual good, right, being united with your end. And it's really great that delight flows from that, but that's a secondary thing. Right? And conversely, for evil, right, the important thing isn't that you're feeling suffering, feeling pain. The important thing is you are lacking something that you're supposed to have. There's something missing, there's something broken, and because of that, you're feeling pain. Okay, so if that's right, so on the one hand, right, that's going to mean it's not as though compassion is just like this necessary evil. What is compassion? Compassion is the right response to a real evil. Right? So, I mean, it's bad that you have the evil itself, right? It's bad that your friend lost his job or that he left the faith or whatever. But to have pain for that, right? Pain by itself is just, it's an act. It's a good thing. And it's whether it's good overall or not depends on is its object appropriate or not. And so seems as though I can say it's completely compatible. That I haven't lost anything by having sorrow for a genuine evil. Like this is good. But with a caveat, right? It might be good, but it's got side effects. Right? So when you're sad, right, when you're suffering, right, it's great if it's for an appropriate object, either in yourself or in someone you love. Fantastic. But it means that, well, if I'm not feeling joy, it's going to be hard for me to do the things I need to do well. Right? Because if I'm to do something well, you got to find joy in it. You got to love it. Right? So if you're just in the dumps because of this bad thing that happened to your friend, so on the one hand, you got to give the right. It's a good sign of love to be reacting to that appropriately. But on the other hand, if you let it go too far, you're not going to be able to do everything else that you're supposed to do. Right? It's debilitating. Nietzsche's not wrong about that. Right? And in particular, it can distract you from real goods. Right? So the more that you give your soul's attention to responding appropriately to one evil, the less you'll be able to think about all these other huge goods over somewhere else. And one of the things about being Christian is that the goods infinitely outweigh the evils, right? Because no matter how serious an evil you're talking about, right, even if it's like deadly sins on the part of someone you love dearly, we love God more, or at least we're supposed to love God even more than we love our closest friends or children or parents or whatever. And he has his good. Nobody can take it away from him, and that's infinite. And so, in the grand scale of things, teeny weeny. Right, so it's good to have sorrow for these things, but it has to be sorrow that's in perspective, doesn't lose sight of what we should have joy over, and doesn't lose sight of what we need to be doing, right, such that we can't do our job. Right, so this is versus the anti-compassion folks. Right? No, sorrow is good in itself; it just has these bad side effects. But on the other hand, right, if it's really true that it's not suffering that's bad, but rather the evil that causes it, the way that our culture and the way that Hume and Rousseau before us thought about sympathy might be fundamentally flawed, right? Because the way most people think about it, I think, is in terms of fellow feeling, right? Feeling what the person that you love feels, right? If they're going through a tough time, I want to be there with them. I want to feel that toughness with them. And it's in the word. Sympathy means feeling with. Compassion, just Latin for the same thing, feeling suffering with. And that's a proxy for the right thing, right? Because when a person is experiencing evil, right, I should suffer for that, and they'll presumably be suffering with it too. So they'll line up. But not always, right? Often, right? So I've got 4 kids. They're pretty young, and they throw hissy fits for all sorts of things, right? And so right, it's not appropriate to feel compassion for somebody who's screaming their head off because you did not give them their 5th serving of ice cream. Right, so there has to be a decoupling that way, and sometimes in the reverse, right? Somebody that you love might be feeling just great, and their life is a mess, and they don't know it, and they don't feel it. I should feel sorrow for that, even more because they don't. Right, so it comes apart in a way that I don't think Hume or Rousseau or their followers get. Right, so on the one hand, we want to agree with them that compassion is good, but not necessarily compassion as they understand it. Okay? And then lastly, an objection. Right, so we're saying We should only have compassion for real evils, not just, right, this person whom I love has tears coming out of their eyes, so I should have tears coming out of my eyes too, but rather, you've got to be zeroing on what's causing that. Is that really evil? Give that the appropriate response from my end. Okay, but as a Christian, are there any real evils? It seems as though we want to say, right, that all these things that we normally think of as evils are really part of God's plan for our good. Right? Aren't we all kind of like the kid who sees his parents' restrictions on his iPad usage as being an evil, but which actually really is good? Aren't we all in that position with respect to God? So what should we say? And Thomas Aquinas says some interesting things about that. So he gives a sort of high-stakes example of, I think it's a mom whose son is committed highway robbery and is caught and is about to be executed by the judge, back in a time when capital punishment was assumed to be the right thing to do. And so Aquinas says, from the judge's point of view, he should want that. He should want the punishment. That's the right thing, because he's got charge of the common good, and he can see that the best thing for the whole of society is the punishment of this criminal. But the mom shouldn't feel that, because her perspective is different, right? So she's zeroing in on the evil of death for somebody I love, and that is her proper domain, her proper perspective. Right? And so Aquinas says, no, I'm not saying that we should have this sort of inhuman kind of conformity to God's will, any more than Christ did in the garden, for that matter. Right? And Christ can say, right, let this cup pass from me. We can say, I don't see why this is happening to you. This is evil. It's a real evil. Take it as mine. It makes me sad. But, caveat, right, we should, even though we can't see, and it's not our job to see how this relates to God's order, God's plan, God's goodness, I still need to know, bear in mind that there is such a plan, such an order, such a goodness, and submit myself, right? So my reaction to tragedy can never be deliberate rejection, saying no. It's always got to be, yeah, this is, as far as I can see, this is bad, and I'm reacting accordingly, objectively bad, but I know this is ordered ultimately towards God's goodness, and that's what I love most of all. So I don't reject it, I accept it. Right? So there's got to be moderation of our sorrow in all of these ways. Right? So not only in proportion to the thing, proportion to other competing goods, proportion to my duties, but also always tempered by the fact that what I really care about is God's goodness, even if I can't see it. And so there's a place for compassion, but not as big of a place, not as absolutizing, you might say, of a place as our culture often would put it. Okay, so I'll conclude with a sort of examination of conscience that one might pull out of these thoughts, right? So I'm thinking about my own compassion. The first question I think I should ask is, all right, is this compassion based simply in what others feel? Is it kind of just simply a mirroring of their emotions? Or is it based in knowledge of what's really good for them, right? And that's the criterion that I think Hume and Rousseau and a lot of our culture fails. Also, is my passion coming out of reason? Or is it just the spontaneous thing that I instinctively feel and hasn't been reflected on, right? That's something to think about. Is this a rational feeling that I'm experiencing? What's my motivation? Is it really love, or is it really that feeling of my own frailty? Right? Is it moderate or immoderate? Is it keeping proportion, right, am I seeing this in proportion to the real goods that I ought to be constantly rejoicing over? Right? And I think you can see this in just the holy people of our experience. Right? The holiest people are both the ones who have the most compassion and also are most at peace at the same time. That's kind of a marvelous thing to see. Right? And lastly, when I exert this compassion, am I doing this as a rejection of this evil, or is it this is it real evil? It hurts, but I see this in line. I know that it goes in line with God's plan, right? So such that it's not a rejection, but an acceptance, sorrowful acceptance. So that's what I'll leave you with. Thank you.